All right, welcome to our webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining today, and we're very happy to have Christina Green with us today. And we hope to go through the legal requirements and best practices related to education and translation services. So just to let everyone know that at the end of the webinar, we will actually be recording the webinar today. And early next week, probably on Monday, we'll go ahead and distribute the recording. We'll also distribute the slides and also a best practices document. So we'll make sure to share that with everyone early next week. And if you have any questions today, please feel free to use the chat function, and you can just ask questions and we will address those when it makes sense in the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start the recording and let's begin. So again, thank you for attending. Just to give you a little bit of a background on Christina. Christina is the owner of Green Linguistics and the founder, and she has also led the charge for translation services for Milwaukee Public Schools since 2006. She has also been president of the American Translators Association. She's also the president of the Midwest Association of Translators and Interpreters, so she's quite active in the community, and we're fortunate to have her today. She's going to go over the legal aspects and give us some information on her work with Milwaukee Public Schools and also with Green Linguistics. And my name is Peter Argondizzo. I'm the founder of Argo Translation, and I was a project manager for a international medical equipment manufacturer as well as a major airline. I attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Argo Translation has offices in Milwaukee and Glenview, which is just outside of Chicago. And we are fortunate enough to help out numerous school districts with translation services. So that's a bit about my background. So again, if we do everything correctly today, we're going to arm you with some information that you can use to cover legal requirements with your colleagues at your school or school district, and arm you with some considerations that you should think about and how you're managing your relationships with your LEP candidates, as well as to give you some best practices and some things to consider when you're handling translation or telephonic interpretation for your schools. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Christina. I should hopefully keep pace with you in terms of changing slides, but if you need me to change a slide, just say slide and I'll do that.
I will do that, Peter. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here. I know for many of you, for most of you, it's lunchtime, so I appreciate your sharing your lunch with us. So I have taught, I have given the seminar quite a bit, or as a webinar mostly, to other school districts. And the first questions I ask is, do you know the difference between a translator and an interpreter? And it seems to be a very basic one, but it's actually surprising to see how many people don't know the difference. So I'm going to start with that very briefly, and I'm going to define what translation is. So translation, the process of converting or changing words from one language to another. So basically, anything that is in writing, we refer to as a translation. In terms of what an interpretation is the facilitation of spoken or signed language. So ASL also falls into this category, and it allows the communication between users of different languages. Okay, so that's the basic difference between those two concepts. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the other thing is, why do we usually provide translation services or interpretation services? For the sake of argument, we're going to call everything translation, okay? So why do we provide translation services? And why do we provide translation services into a school district? So many of the answers vary. If I have my audience in front of me, they are going to tell me, well, because we need to facilitate communication between parents, because we want to bridge the gap. We want to, show them that we care about them. There's a myriad of answers, and they are all correct. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the law. And so the first part I'm going to talk is about the Executive Order 1366. This law contains two major initiatives, and it was designed to better enforce and implement the existing obligation, which was provide assistance, federal assistance, to help the recipients who were not who were in a level of poverty that was below the federal guidelines, and who needed some assistance with the language. So English proficient, English learners were falling into this category. So each federal agency had to, based on this, develop a plan for providing the access. For example, I don't know, Immigration and Naturalization Services and Federal Bureau of Investigation or the Civil Rights Division and other agencies, they had to provide a plan. They had to create a plan, and they had to meet certain standards and in order to qualify for federal assistance. So again, limited English proficient individuals would fall into this category. So that's Executive Order 13166. So then we have the 2015 reauthorization of ESEA. So this this was originally created in 1965 and was originally passed as part of the Lyndon B. Johnson administration War on Poverty campaign. So the original goal of the law, which still remains today, by the way, was improve educational equity for students from lower income families. And the way they would do that was by providing federal funds to school districts serving poor students. So, of course, again, English learners would fall into this category. Then the following one, always part of the reauthorization of 2000 of this ESEA. This ESEA has been reauthorized 8 times since 1965. Most recently, by the way, in December of 2015, when lawmakers, we will all remember, revamped the dreaded No Child Left Behind and called it Every Student Succeeds Act, so ESSA. So each of these reauthorizations brought changes to this program. And despite all the changes, the goal has always been the same, which was improving the educational opportunities and outcomes for children from lower income families. This includes as well access to language. So it includes our children, our limited English proficient students. So then we have Part 8 of Title III. Title III is a very sought after and we hear it a lot. We hear a lot about Title III in the school community. Milwaukee Public Schools has 168 schools, has about close to 65,000 students. And not all the schools are bilingual. We have bilingual schools. We have different schools that we'll explain a little bit further up. But this Title III basically is it's the language acquisition piece from the No Child Left Behind, the ESSA that is right now. So this we use. I'll explain to you what MPS does with Title III funds and how do we get those funds. So we petition those funds, and as I understand it, every school district should do the same. They petition the funds to the Department of Education, the state, to the superintendent, let's say the state superintendent of education. So those funds get petitioned that way, and they are used to supplement certain programs, not to replace them. So that's very important that we understand this concept. Title III funds can never replace an existing program. So if you have been using, let's say, a grant from the Bill Gates Foundation or from Title I or from any other, whether private or public funding, to do a certain project that involves translation and interpreting, Title III funds should not come to replace that money, but rather to supplement. So you still have to have either some funding from the same original grant that you have, plus the Title III to work together to reach the goal you need, whether it's providing interpreters or provide translations, or just create or catalog it in a different way so you can use your entirety of Title III funds for that. Now, Title III can also be used for other things. It does not have to do only with translation and interpretation, but it's the one grant that you can use for interpreting and translating. So that's very important. So you petition that through the state, and they will give you a list of, because even if it's federal monies, it will still have different ways of being requested and implemented based on the state in which you are. If you are in Wisconsin and you want some information about it, I'll be happy to, help you. My information is in the end, so you can email me and I will be happy to connect you with the people you need to talk to. Then we have Title I. So for Title I deals mainly with the requirements around state academic assessment, so reading, math, and science. And it requires that students with limited English proficiency take part in the state academic assessment. So now, how does a child who does not speak the language do in order to do this? Well, that's where the part of the languages comes in. And you could successfully, at least MPS has quite successfully used some kind of, some part of the funding for Title I to do some translations. For instance, the state tests in Wisconsin, they were originally called, they have changed now, but they were originally called WKCE. So the WKCE was translated under the mandate of the Department of Education. MPS took charge of that and translated that, and part of the money to do that came from Title I. It was very clear that everything had to have equal treatment. That is, if the English version had some, pictures of coins, the Spanish version had to have the pictures of coins. For the tests. And then you had to localize the things. So for example, and I mentioned the coins in particular because we had one of the questions for our defunct WKCE was they were showing, a quarter, a dime, a penny, and the question was, which one is 25 cents? So it's funny because in Spanish, you don't have the word for quarter or for penny, you just call it, a 25-cent coin or a 5-cent coin. So you had to kind of localize it, not to give unfair advantage to the children. So that's, very important. But, I digress somehow. So let's continue. We're going to talk about Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act, believe it or not, they actually, I would say, furthered our agenda of providing a fairer treatment in terms of languages to all the school districts. That's because we have, in every school district, we have children with special education needs. And the special education needs children fall under the category of Medicaid or Medicare. And that's where the federal government comes in. So the Section 1557 prohibits the discriminations on the grounds of race, color, national origin, sex, age, or disability in certain health programs and activities. If you walk into a hospital, the first thing you're going to see is a sign written in many languages saying, if you do not speak your language, please point, and an interpreter will be provided to you at no cost. You do that, every hospital providing phone interpreting services like those provided by Peter and Argo Translation. They have exactly the same thing. And basically, we're doing this not just to be nice to the patient or to the customer, it's because it's an obligation. So with this was originally created to lower the readmission rates for hospitals, because believe it or not, when there were studies conducted as to why the readmission rate was so high for certain hospitals, it was determined that it had to do with lack of understanding of discharge instructions by the patients. And it didn't only have to do with the language, but also with the level of language. So for anything that is federally mandated, we need to provide everything at a 5th grade level, whether it's in English or in any other language. And we have to provide it in a way that parents understand it. So that means that if we do it in writing and still the parents do not understand, then we have to go ahead and explain it orally. And that is painfully evident for some of the languages that do not have a formal written language, or in which, for example, we see it a lot in refugees, refugee populations who do not read and write. So we still have to provide the written documents. However, because they don't understand, then we have to explain to them in terms that they can actually make, that they can understand it, so they can make an informed decision. That's the main goal, okay, as we know. So the protections for individuals with limited English proficiency. So obviously we know that an LEP person is someone whose primary language of communication is not English, and somebody also who has limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English. That means that we need to take reasonable steps to provide assistance into the language that they speak. And that is through, as I said, written translation or oral translation, through an interpreter, through the phone services, either one. And by the way, the federal government accepts all of them. They just want us to have a certain level of preparation. And I will talk a little bit about that as well. So the next slide is going to be about the other laws, which are like FAPE and IDEA, most related to children with disabilities. And to those of you in the educational system who have been long enough in education, you guys know that for the longest time, the language, like Spanish, I mean, students who didn't speak English were also considered disabled, or were falling into this category of children with disabilities. So then there's also Title VI Medicare recipients. These are all almost exclusively our children who receive special education services and medical services within the school setting in order to help them or assist them through the educational system. And then you have the Medicaid school-based services, which is pretty much the same thing. Okay, so then I'm going to ask again the question, why do we provide translation and interpreting services? Because it is the law. And this is something that is very important that we understand, because sometimes I have encountered, and this is totally fine, I'm not criticizing it, one way or the other, but it's very interesting. Some people think that we are accommodating, it's like a courtesy to the parents that we're doing this. It's not really a courtesy, it's the law. It's what we have to do. Then the degrees and the levels by which we do this, it's a different story. So that's very important to know. So how do we determine the languages in a school district? So again, I'm going to speak for Milwaukee Public Schools and or the adjacent school districts that I work with, that Cree Linguistics works with. So we have, as public school district, the responsibility to provide access to the programs and activities, not only to students, but to the parents and other community members. So this is one of the titles that falls into this category, which is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 118.13, and this is Wisconsin statutes, and this deals exclusively with provision of language services for people who are non-English speakers. Some additional requirements related to parents of students with disabilities, and they can be found in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And again, I'm just citing the specific example of Wisconsin. This information you can find through the Department of Education of your own state. And, you should, even though you'll be surprised how little information there is for some of these things, for the special education, there is quite a bit of information. So,
Christina, a great question just came in, if I can interrupt.
Yeah, absolutely.
So she had asked, is this federal? So Jennifer, great question. She asks, is this federal law? In other words, is it federal law to provide translation and interpretation services? And if so, when did this go in effect?
Well, it goes in effect since 1964 with the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So that's when it started. Okay, and then it has developed. And it has developed to include other groups. Or I would say for translation specifically, It started first with American Sign Language, okay, and ADA, so American with Disabilities Act. And titles it's of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 included this meaningful access, and through the meaningful access, it included the language provision. So anybody who speaks a language other than English and it's receiving, I'm sorry, any agency who caters or who serves people who speak a language other than English and receives federal funding must provide services in that language. And I will give you the 4 instances in which that happens: a police station, a court of law, a hospital, and a school. And you need to provide, a school district in general, you need to provide meaningful access to those people who don't speak English to defend themselves into a court of law, to being able to carry a conversation with meaning at a police station, to be able to understand what is wrong with them in a medical setting, and last but not least, to make informed decisions about their children's education. So those are the 4 that are always, always, always mandatory. Most of the hospitals are non-for-profit organizations, and they provide these services. It's mandated because also, we have assisted with, and that's a complete another webinar, totally different. But basically, it's a matter of insurance, it's a matter of liability, and it's a matter of few other elements. But someone, regardless of their status, regardless of their citizenship, regardless of any language they speak, they have the inherent right to understand when they have to make a decision for the school for their children, medical services, and court of law. I don't know if that answers the question, if you want to know anything else.
Great, thank you, Christina. I think that was really good. Thank you. There was another note that came up about some background noise. I apologize. I am. And by the way, Jennifer said that was right on target. So thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
There was a note about some background noise. I apologize. I am in an open office setting, so I'm going to make sure to mute myself, and that may assist. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. Christina, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so again, I'm going to speak about Milwaukee Public Schools, and our current student population, non-English speakers, is English learners. Then we have students with refugee backgrounds, and then we have bilingual and standalone. Now, for these English learners, how do we decide what languages we're going to translate into? Because we have some schools where there's 2 or 3 Hindi families or Punjab families. We have a school where we have 1 or 2 people who speak Swahili, for example. So do we provide everything from the district in those languages? No, we don't. So how do we do with the English learners? So according to the law, at least our state law, the way we find that out is we determine if we have a 5% of the total school population who speaks a language other than English, then it is our duty to provide those services into that language. So for example, for Milwaukee Public Schools, the second language after English, of course, is Spanish. And it has absolutely nothing to do with their immigration status or their legal, standing within the nation. It doesn't matter. We have to provide it because they account for more than 5% of the total school population. When it comes to refugee students, it doesn't matter how many they are. Whether you have 1 or you have 50,000, you have to provide the services because the monies that you're receiving to provide services for the refugee students are coming directly from the federal government and the Office for Refugees. So it's I find very interesting to note that when you have refugee students, it's actually a very, it's a delicate situation for many reasons. Wisconsin has received a number of students from refugee nations who have been the families have been vetted for many years, and they have lived mostly in refugee camps. And so when they come to our state, they come through, after they have been vetted for years, they come through one of the agencies that help them resettle and do, getting used and learn, assimilate, let's just call it that. So the two major agencies in Wisconsin are Lutheran Services and Catholic Charities. So we work directly with them. Now, interestingly, these families come, when they arrive, they already have a green card, okay? And we assist them in finding a job. They can apply for citizenship after 5 years of being here. But there's one part that people don't usually know is that they all come with debt. Each member of the family that is brought to the United States, regardless of their and age or sex or whatever, they come with a debt of $800 that has to be paid back to the federal government. That is the cost that the federal government is charging them to bring them to the United States. So we help them find a job, or the resettlement agency helps them find a job. And every month, the federal government takes a part of that pay out so they can pay back that money. Okay, so I wanna say that because I think it's important and not many people know it. And then we have the students, the bilingual and standalone students. We can go to the next slide, Peter, please. Thank you. So these are the top languages in the Milwaukee schools based on that 5% that I was talking about. So of course, number one is English, number two Spanish, then we have Hmong, and this Hmong was from 20, 30 years ago after the Vietnam War, after the refugees came from that area between Laos and Vietnam. And the variant that we have in Milwaukee is the white. So it's white Hmong. Then we have Arabic. We had a number of Iraqi refugees, and then Syrian refugees, then Burmese, Karen, right, from that area of Burma, Somali, and Rohingya. Funny enough, with the Rohingya, who are persecuted because of religious reasons, and they are mostly in the area of Burma. The funny thing about it, they have come to 3 states in the United States. So Wisconsin is the one with the largest Rohingya population. We have 600 families, and they all attend Milwaukee Public Schools. Then we have Illinois, and then the last one is Georgia. And for Rohingya, for example, our parents, they lived in refugee camps forever. So they speak several languages. They not only speak Rohingya, some of them speak Malay, some of them you can have them speak Karen. So we kind of adapt to what they need. And the difficulty is that we don't have those languages in person, because we don't have enough translators or enough interpreters who understand enough English in order to be able to interpret. But we do, to the best of our ability. So that's a word that I use a lot, to the best of our ability. We use the resources we have, meaning we use phone interpreting services, and we use video remote interpreting. And those are vetted, and they are okay by the federal government. For example, the service that Peter provides, all the translators that he provides in terms of phone interpreting and video remote interpreting, they are based in the United States. So they are okay to use based on the needs and requirements imposed by the federal government. You can go to the next slide, please. These are the additional languages that we provide per school. So we have a school, for example, where the percentage of Swahili students is very large, but it doesn't account to 5% of the entire district. So what we do is that we provide only the school-specific documents into that language. Swahili, Karenni, Urdu, Punjabi, Serbian, and Tigrinya are some of the languages, and it's increasing every time. So it has been very interesting. Keep going to the next one. Okay, so then as I was saying, the refugee status, this mostly families fleeing war-torn countries. They are helped by resettlement agencies. They have the legal benefits, can become citizens after 5 years, and they are by all intents and purposes considered documented immigrants. You can go to the next. I think that should be. So why are we providing translation services? So please remember, it is the law. If you have any questions, I am going to be available. I think, I usually go a little fast through the laws because I figure that they are not particularly engaging. So people get somewhat bored. So I try to pick on the most important parts. But the most important thing is, and one thing that the school districts need to understand, and that happened to me when I first arrived to Milwaukee Public Schools. It was very common to see a parent coming with a friend who was bilingual helping that person, a secretary assisting, even children sometimes, and not only at the school level. I was the first certified interpreter, legally certified interpreter for the state of Wisconsin, and I used to see that in divorce court, where you had two parents who didn't speak English and then their child interpreting for them. Well, that's illegal. So we don't want to have a minor interpreting for them because that's not legal at all. I mean, that's plain illegal. Then we have the friend of the friend or the neighbor or the cousin who speaks, the language and they want to interpret. So it's entirely your decision. Milwaukee Public Schools has the policy that we do not allow that because we do not want to give that person the voice to speak for us, for Milwaukee Public Schools. We want to have somebody trained, somebody who's bonded, somebody who can be, held liable. And, it is very interesting. People think that they are going to go bankrupt when they are going to start using interpreting services. I can guarantee you, you are not. And I can guarantee you it's going to be a load off your mind. You can use a secretary. Of course, you can use the secretary to answer a phone, to do, the initial, I don't know, intake, whatever you're doing. But when it comes to doing an IEP, don't use a teacher. A teacher has a conflict of interest in that. Just bring an interpreter who knows what she's doing, who can lead the conversation the way it is, who doesn't have a vested interest in that meeting, and who can be a neutral partner in that relationship. That's what you want. And then you are safe. You would be complying with everything. Most of the agencies, and I know Peter for years, so I know that he provides the services through people who are certified, who are accredited, who have some kind of certification of, and so in most of the translation agencies, that's the way they work. So you are going to be safe if you do that. So I think that that's it for me, right, Peter?
Yes, that's great, Christina. Thank you. That was really good. I have a question, and I know it's one
Yeah.
that comes up when in conversations that happen with me and some of the school districts, and also with some of our staff as they're working to get schools service in terms of translation of documentation as well as interpretation. The question is, we're a brand new school district. We have these new families that are have these language challenges. Where do I start? What do I do? What would you recommend, Christina, if this is a new school district, they've never done translation? What are some of the steps you would suggest they take in terms of trying to get some funding and trying to get their program off the ground?
Sure, sure. So there are two things that you can do. So the first thing, if you have a Department of Bilingual Education, then maybe they can guide you as to how to apply for the Title III funds and Title I funds. So that would be very good. If you don't have that, then I would just straight call the Department of Education and find out how can you apply for that and what exactly do you need and what the requirements are. Sometimes the filling of the papers is insane, but I think it's worthwhile. The second thing I would do is I would find a way of sitting with my superintendent or with the school board, because they need to understand and they need to have some buy-in in the process. You need to know, for years Milwaukee Public Schools did not have money for interpreting and for translating, and there were two complaints lodged against us by the Office of Civil Rights, and again, not once but twice. And we were given warnings, and we were given, a lot of. I mean, it was a headache, basically, just to make a very long story short. And what we did is that we sat with the superintendent and we said, okay, it's time for us to allocate some funding for this. Now you have to have more or less an idea of what exactly do you need, and you do that by just looking at your needs in special education. You look at that by you calculate that by seeing how many publications your district has. So if you have a publication that is, you don't have to translate absolutely everything, but if you have a publication, for example, as to the rules and regulations of the school district in general, the disciplinary proceedings, the I don't know, the signing for waivers of whatever it is, for insurance, for sports, all those things that are legal in nature, you have to translate into the different languages. Again, trust me, an agency will do it much more effectively, and they are responsible for their own work. So that's what I always tell MPS, and what I always tell the other districts I work with. If you don't like it, you can sue me, and it would fly. I mean, I'm not saying that's what you want to do. I'm not inferring, but you need to talk to your superintendent, and you need to have some funding allocated for that, whether it's through your bilingual office, your communications office, you figure it out. But the district has to have allocation for that, and in addition to the Title III funding. Mhm.
That's great. Thank you, Christina. And when we get to my part of the presentation and best practices, we can talk a little bit about budgeting, because I think I have some ideas relative to that that could maybe help a new district. One of the things that we do in terms of getting some numbers together. A great question just came in, though, and it was relative to your comment on the conflict of interest in an IEP meeting. Um, the question is, a teacher cannot interpret during an IEP meeting because of a conflict of interest. Can you please expand? So if you could tell us a little bit about that conflict.
Yes, I will explain that to you, and again, I will speak from my experience and from what I have seen in other school districts. So when you are interpreting at a meeting, wherever that is, if it's in a court, in an IP, in a medical setting, you are always, always, always external to the whole process as the interpreter. So I go in, I just do my interpretation. I don't inject anything in. I don't give my opinion. I don't skew, the comments. I don't add. I don't subtract. That is very hard to happen when you're interpreting for your student. If you speak Spanish and your team speaks Spanish and everybody's speaking Spanish to the parent, then by all means go right ahead. But if you have one person, if people are depending on you and you are the child's teacher, don't do it. You want to have an interpreter who speaks on behalf of you to the parent and on the parent's behalf to you, and you need to listen to that. If you are a teacher who doesn't have anything to do with this child, but you're brought in because you're bilingual, reality is I can be a very eloquent person, but I am not a teacher. So being bilingual makes you a translator as much as breathing makes you a pulmonary expert. A translator knows what they are doing. Let them do their job. There is a conflict because you have a vested interest in this child. Everybody has the same interest in that room, which is getting the child to get better and to have better grades and whatever. The interpreter has no interest whatsoever other than communicating. So remember, keep that in mind. Does that answer your question, or you want me to elaborate more?
No, I think that's great, Christina. Thank you very much. And by the way, if there are any additional questions, Christina's going to be with us for this part of the presentation as well. So no problem. Just go ahead and use the chat function or the question function, and I'll make sure that Christina addresses a question. So, Christina, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mute your microphone now, and I'll
That's
go
fine.
ahead and get started with our part. And if, again, if any questions come up, please feel free to use that. So, what we plan to do with the next part of this, I want to echo a little bit of what Christina said. And of course, she had mentioned that it's the law, and I also think it's the right thing to do. In other words, as educators, the goal should, of course, be to get all of our students to engage. And as a child of an immigrant family, I can actually concur with that. My folks came from Italy in the 60s, and it was nice that at the school district I was in, they tried their best to include my folks. Now, and at that time, there wasn't as much interpretation going on, but there were My father spoke Spanish as well, so with some of the Spanish teachers, there was some assistance, and they're trying to get my parents involved in my education. So I certainly appreciated that growing up, and I would imagine that all of your students and families that you serve will as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So what are some of the projects that you might see as an educator? Obviously, there's translation. Christina had mentioned talking about the waiver forms relative to athletics. It might be your school bus policy. It might be menus. It could be really any number of documents that you might see. And then, of course, there's interpretation. You may want to have an interpreter present for an IEP meeting, disciplinary meetings, or just really to welcome a family to the district so they understand better how things work. Because remember, when these folks come here, especially if it's a situation where it might be a refugee family, everything is going to be completely foreign. Obviously, our education system is very different. So that's going to be important to try to get the families to become a part of the community as quickly as possible. And in some cases, we even do some narration or some voiceover work or subtitling to support video efforts. So let's talk about a few things to consider. There's really about 10 that I like to talk about, but for the sake of the presentation, I limited it to 5. And we will, when we distribute the video, we're also going to provide the slides, but also provide that ebook that has the 10 things to consider. But these were the 5 I wanted to focus on for today. We'll talk about proper register, regional considerations, some tips for when you engage with an interpreter, as well as a little bit on reporting and documentation, as well as the use of translation memory. So let's talk about register first. Christina had mentioned that as part of the guidelines, the goal is to provide documentation that is suitable for a 5th grade reading level. And the same will go for obviously in translation. You'll want to make sure to keep things short and simple, using familiar words, and also understand that because they're new to this country, there are words that will make no sense, whether it's acronyms or food items. I always chuckle when we were doing some menus that in Hmong, actually, the word bagel doesn't exist in Hmong. So things tend to be a little bit more on an explanation. So expect that there will be some things that are longer, whether that's in interpretation or in translation. And you'll also want to use language that's culture and gender neutral. And keeping things in the active voice is also very, very important. And using the imperative is also a really good choice for when you're setting up your documentation. So let's talk a little bit about regional considerations. When Christina was talking a bit about the dialects that they serve, keep in mind sublanguages. In other words, there's many flavors of Spanish. And if you're in a school district where maybe the families you're seeing are mainly Cuban speakers, well, know that. Make sure to communicate that information to whoever you're working with, whether it's a translation service provider or an interpreter. Make sure that they know a bit about the population of your district, because that'll help them to better serve you. And by the way, if Spanish is the language, but you're in a district where you have Cuban families, families from all over Latin America and South America, let them know that you're going to need something that's as neutral as possible. There really is no neutral Spanish per se, but if your budget, to stretch your budget dollars, you may want to let them know that you can do one version of Spanish and you're serving multiple communities. That'll help them. You'll again want to be careful with references to organizations like PTA, SAT, ACT, IEP. These are all things that really don't mean much to someone who's new to this country and not an English speaker, as well as 911 and TSA and FAA and all these federal organizations, HIPAA. These are all things that are new. And the same will go in education, say like a consumer education class or something that goes over institutions in this country. So we're talking about Social Security and 401k and health insurance. Those are all, again, things that may be foreign to your audience. And be careful with slang and humor. Obviously, some of those things may go over your audience's head, not understanding our culture completely. And of course, think about holidays as well in terms of Halloween and Memorial Day. Those are things that would obviously be completely foreign. So a little bit about interpretation, just some tips. I won't go over every point, but one of the most important things to do is when you engage with an interpreter, clearly state the goal of the call. In other words, this is an IEP meeting and we're meeting about these different points. So just spend a few minutes to give the interpreter the goal of the call and set the tone for what you're hoping to accomplish. And you'll want to choose a location that has minimal background noise if possible. And if you can avoid using a speakerphone, that's great. If you have to use a speakerphone, use a high quality one. If your district or your school ends up doing a lot of telephonic interpretation, there are some inexpensive options out there for phones with multiple handsets. So that might be something that you might consider. Or getting a nicer speakerphone. You'll want to greet the interpreter, and as Christina had alluded to earlier, you almost want to treat them as if they're you don't want to speak to the interpreter. You want to speak to your audience, the parent or the student that you're trying to engage with. The interpreter is there to assist you, but think of them really as sort of a mirror. You're going to speak, and they're going to repeat what you're saying, and you'll want to make sure to avoid overly long sentences. You'll want to break up these sentences in smaller pieces if possible. Don't speak for a half an hour and expect the interpreter to be able to recite everything verbatim. You'll want to speak slowly and at an even pace. And careful with switching directions or changing ideas in the middle of a sentence. That will obviously make the communication very difficult. And in terms of questions, when you're expecting a response, I would suggest doing that one at a time. That would be best. And if for some reason you feel like clarification needs to happen, feel free to stop and request clarification through the interpreter. That is not a problem and is to be expected. So we'll talk a little bit about proper reporting and documentation. All too often in our world, just so you understand, so telephonic interpretation is typically billed by the minute. And translation is typically billed by the word, but don't be overly fixated on that per word price. Education documentation tends to be repetitive year over year. If you have a school bus policy, it usually doesn't get reinvented every year. You might make some tweaks. So this is where it's very important, and we'll talk about translation memory, but think of it this way. In the next slide, we're talking about translation memory, but let's talk about it now so you understand. And then we'll come back to this slide. So translation memory is basically a really intelligent database that sits alongside the translator. So as they're translating your documentation, each sentence is memorized and committed to this database. And the reason we do that is, number one, for consistency, but also to save you money. So when you come back the next year to do that bus policy again, if only a small percentage of it is changed, the translation service provider should only charge you on the differential. So that's really important. So as you have material that's translated over and over again, you're only paying on the differential. So this is going to help you reduce time on projects, reduce the cost, and increase consistency. So especially if you have documents that are similar to one another, that's going to be very helpful. So going back to this budgeting step, again, don't be overly fixated on the per word price. I would have an honest and frank conversation with your provider to say, well, how will you manage the translation memory? Whose property is it? If we should work with you for 5 years, may I have the translation memory after that period? How will you discount repetitions and matches? And believe it or not, you should even get discounts on what are called fuzzy matches. So fuzzy matches are sentences that are similar but not identical. And also, will you provide me with a report either on a quarterly and an annual basis? And this is incredibly important if you're doing budgeting. The provider should be able to provide a report to you that shows you how much you've spent per language, per quarter, per year, per month. They should be able to give you that information so you don't have to do a lot of legwork as you're trying to get budgets approved through whatever sources you're using for funding. So that wraps up my presentation. I went through it quickly, and we'll certainly provide you with some support material. And I'm certainly going to leave this on screen here, and it'll be given to you in the slides as well when we follow up. But feel free to reach out to either Christina or to myself, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Before we finish for the day, because we'd like to get you out of here on time, we're again at 48 minutes. Are there any additional questions? I think we've covered everything that came through the panel so far. I'm going to go ahead and unmute Christina at this time. All right, Christina, welcome back.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we stop for the day? Okay, there is one more. Um, Christina, you had briefly mentioned a little bit about, and I think it kind of goes along with the conflict of interest. You had mentioned a little bit about um, people having either a friend or a student or sort of a bystander provide an interpretation. Can you expand a little bit on the risks that are associated with just having someone that's outside of the process get involved?
Yes, absolutely. So again, the idea is that you don't want anybody who does have a vested interest, and you want somebody who's, trained for that. So I will give you a practical example. Usually, I think that if I give you an example, we understand it better. I do remember having interpreted for a student who was pregnant. She was underage. She was pregnant. Her mother was there, and by the time I got to the school, the mother was already, or somebody, a family friend, was already assisting the mother and the student into understanding what was happening. So she was at risk apparently for, she was too young, her condition, I don't remember. And she was asking, they were talking about how many ounces her baby measured based on an ultrasound. And I remember they said, your baby is 4 ounces or 5 ounces. And she asked, how much is that? And the quote unquote interpreter said, it's like a chunk of meat. When he said 4 ounces, she replied, it's a chunk of meat. So that's the translation that the student got, that her baby weighed a chunk of meat. So that's the risk you're running through. And
That's
the risk
terrible.
is, yeah, well, and the risk is that at that time, at the moment that that lady is saying it's a chunk of meat, she is speaking for the school district. She is not speaking for herself. You see what I mean? So she is actually supposedly conveying what the school district is telling this non-English speaker person. And so what you want to do is avoid any type of possibility that there is a misinterpretation. The only way you can do that is by getting somebody who's trained specifically for that job and who has nothing to do with the school district and no interest whatsoever in the outcome. Because in reality, I know it sounds callous and crass, but we don't care what happens as interpreters. We just go. The only thing I need to make sure is that what you say gets conveyed directly to the other person and vice versa. Whether there's a resolution in your issue or not, I go home and I sleep well and I forget about your case 5 minutes late. So the only way of doing that is this way. If you try to bring a child, or even a child who's, I don't know, let's suppose you have a 16-year-old and that child is being used as a translator, as an interpreter. What's going to happen inevitably is as soon as the professor, the teacher says, you have been super bad and you don't come to class, the child is going to say, well, he has an issue because he doesn't like me. So that's going to be the translation. You don't want to risk any of that. You want to have somebody at the same level who's an interpreter trained in understanding what the process is. At MPS, and I know that Peter does the same with his team, we actually train people. The people who go there, we regularly, quarterly, we see them and we run, mock-up scenarios and, we do IEPs and things like that. And speaking of which, IEPs are legal requirements. When you have a child who's has special education needs, it's not optional. You have to provide them with an individualized education plan, and so that has to be MPS requested that those were translated. The written part of it was translated into the language, but not all school districts do that. But the interpreter part, it is very important that whomever we send is trained and qualified, if not certified, to do the translation, the interpretation into the language that they speak. Did I confuse you more? Did I answer your question?
I think that was perfect, Christina. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and conclude as we're approaching the hour. And I want to thank you, Christina, for all your wonderful insight. I think that was really helpful, and I think it'll help people to get their program off the ground, and it gives them a little insight on how. Oh, actually, there is one more. I'm sorry, Christine. Let's
Yes.
go ahead and let's do one more. So sometimes we have teachers, by the way, thank you, this is a good question. Sometimes we have teachers that are bilingual and want to present their information in Spanish during an IEP meeting and ask the interpreter to interpret into English for the rest of the team. We don't encourage that, but they do it often. Can
No.
this get the school in trouble?
Yes. No, 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 no. You don't want to do that. No, 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 no. And we see it a lot. So this is what happens. Everybody speaks the language. Everybody speaks English. Your parents speak Spanish. Your teacher needs to speak English with the parent. Everybody else needs to hear the same thing that comes from the mouth of the interpreter. So, and that would be the same case if you're in a court of law. We had a trial at a court of law where the jury, one of the jurors, spoke Spanish, and he wanted me to speak louder so he could hear me rather than hearing hear me and the witness rather than hearing what the others were saying in English. And the judge said, absolutely not. You will hear what I hear in English, not what she's saying in Spanish. And that is the same for an IEP. Your Spanish speaking teacher needs to hear from the interpreter's mouth what she is saying in English to the rest of the team, because they all need to hear the same thing. Unless, she determines that the interpreter is lousy, which has never happened to us, but, it may happen. In that case, there are the ways, there are the procedures we follow, but otherwise, your interpreter is there to interpret for the parent. And we have some when we train our interpreters to do the IEPs, that's one of the things that they have to read. They will say, you speak one at a time, please speak in short sentences, and also please, all of you, even if you speak the language that mom speaks, please speak English and I will be the interpreter.
Wonderful. Thank you for covering that. So I think we're at our time. And Christina, again, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And we will go ahead and provide the recording and the slides, as well as the additional information I promised. Thank you very much. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to Christina. Thanks.
Yes, please.
And have a good
Thank you
weekend.
very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.